But I want to start out by asking kind of a few basic questions for you.
Mhm.
Recently, in one of his Ask Doug podcast videos, Pastor Doug Wilson recently said that there needs to be a Christian take on free market economics, especially from the Austrian or Chicago school.
So economics, basically the Austrian school and Chicago school of free market economics, I think has a lot to offer. And I think there needs to be a Christian take on that. I think we need a Christian thinker to incorporate free market economics in a Christian setting.
And that kind of piqued my interest a bit. And as I was reading Lessons for the Uneconomist on page 2, don't worry, I'm farther along than page 2, but you wrote, the ability to think like an economist is a crucial component for your education. Only with sound economic thinking will you be able to make sense of how the world works, to make responsible decisions regarding grand political ideas, as well as your occupation and mundane household finances. You must first decide to learn basic economics. So just in general, what is economics and why should we as Christians even care about it?
Okay, great question. So I think, it's thinking like an economist. So this isn't something that I would put like in terms of I would think longer and harder about it. And probably the way I'm motivated in the textbook chapters is more eloquent. But the way of sort of thinking rationally through consequences and understanding the role of incentives and different institutional structures and just how, in particular, property rights are used and the consequences of using them, and just seeing how people interact in solving the problem of material scarcity. And so I think there's a large area of human interaction. And I guess, see, it's not that, so economics certainly includes money, but it's more than just that. It's not just commercial transactions.
Yeah.
And so I think did I have it? No, I think I had it in Choice, where I went through and I quoted from a bunch of different economists. It's a tricky subject when you ask, like, you look at different economics books and you, like in the beginning, like to say, how are we going to delimit what our field of inquiry is? And, they actually, but it's basically rational choice, I think is the substance of what economics is. And that's why Ludwig von Mises titled his magnum opus Human Action. Okay, so when you say like what's action, he means as opposed to like reflexive behavior. So when human beings make decisions and we're interpreting them as, they're trying to accomplish some goal, that's, purposeful behavior, or what Mises would just call as action. So he doesn't use the word rational because to him that's redundant, that by action it means you're using your reason to try to achieve an end. And so that's what the rationals, or the scientific study, that's what's called praxeology in Mises' terminology. So that's largely what economics is. So that includes narrowly commercial things, but in general, when people, I would say, like, you could say think strategically, but I think that might be misleading to people. They might think it's just talking about games or some sort of, a certain type of interaction. But in general, when people use means to achieve ends, that's the scope of what economics focuses on. And then when you put those types of activities in the institutional context of having private property and money, then that's what most people think of. Oh yeah, that's economics.
Yeah.
And so the reason, why I study that, just as there's all sorts of other, like, that's clearly not what physics is, right? And so should Christians be familiar with physics? I think so, just to understand there's apparent rules that govern the material universe, or energy and matter. And it's interesting to study that, just to, one thing, understand God's creation, but also just help you make sense of the world. Mm-hmm. And likewise, there are patterns or rules, if you will, that emerge when you study that sort of purposeful behavior, and particularly when you put it in the context of private property and money, and that's what economics is. So I think that's a wide open area that is rich for human inquiry. And in terms of just seeing it's like, so now, my Christian perspective on it is that it's an amazing thing where God designed the order such that even when people are acting in selfish ways, they unwittingly end up promoting what's called the general welfare. Maybe a little sloppy in terminology. And so, I mean, that's, this is standard stuff like, oh, Joseph and his brothers, what you intended for evil, God, used for good.
Yeah.
So I think you see that shining through. And of course, the obvious reference here is Adam Smith's invisible hand. And let me just say this before I forget. What's funny is one of the papers I want to write is just to document when this misquotation came into vogue. But nowadays, if you ask a regular economist, hey, what did Adam Smith say? He'll say, oh, yeah, people act as if guided by an invisible hand.
Right.
But in the original thing, Smith didn't say as if.
Mm-hmm.
He just said they're guided by an invisible hand.
Right. So you believe that it was God's hand that he's talking about there?
I think so, or I suspect so. I would want to investigate more, but for sure, the actual, I have not found Adam Smith ever saying as if. That was introduced later by economists, and then that got, so I grew up thinking the quote was as if, and then once I looked it up, and I was like, oh, wait a minute, no, it isn't.
Yeah, I believe that the Christian Libertarian Institute podcast recently did a really good kind of breakdown of Adam Smith, and in there, I saw kind of his Christianity informing his understanding of the Wealth of Nations writing, because he's talking about how people when we have kind of this free market system, we are using people's fallen nature in order to get them to produce a benefit to mankind. So by acting selfishly, we're turning potential warlords who 200, 300 years ago would have gained power through their might, and are allowing them to put that energy into producing goods for people and saying, haha, now I've turned a profit. Oh, good. I mean, everyone benefits from that. And so I think he's talking about man's fallen nature when he talks about their selfish kind of normal attitude. Yeah,
I agree with all that. Also, too, just to give more of a better answer, or fuller answer to your original question, as a Christian, too, just studying economics, I think in particularly the strand of it that you could call free market economics, for lack of a better term, I think it shows, let me put it this way, a lot of the stuff that Jesus teaches, like on the Sermon on the Mount or something, it sounds crazy, right? And like the world says, no, that couldn't possibly work. That's a suicide strategy if you were to do that. And so you see echoes of that sort of, incredulity in political issues too. Like, oh, are you kidding me? Like you can't, like if you went back into the Middle Ages and there was like the system of, people having different occupations just spelled out for them with guilds and so on. And you said, no, how about just anybody who wants to become a cobbler can become a cobbler. It's not that your dad has to have done that and train you and raise you, or you have to go find an existing master to train. Just, you want to be a farmer, go be a farmer. You want to be a painter, go do that. You want to be a carpenter, go ahead and just let anyone be what they want. And no one can force you to pick an occupation. The average person would have said that's crazy, because what if everyone chooses to be a farmer? Then there's not going to be any carpenters. What if nobody decides to be a farmer? We're going to starve to death. That's nutty. And if you sat there and tried to say, oh no, don't worry, wages would adjust, and that would give the feedback people would, that would sound stupid. That would sound like a very risky thing, to say the least. And they would probably tell you quite, we have experience here. We clearly know that your system of free labor choice wouldn't possibly work.
Yeah.
And so so that things like that in general. So, me coming more and more, there was a period of atheism in my life, but I was still a free market economist at that stretch. So I'm saying that having that in my back pocket like that, I think helps open up my mind to see the possibilities that, just because, or the things Jesus teaches, even though that sounds like, oh, that couldn't possibly work, that no, you're being too cynical and jaded. If more and more people actually did this and listened to them, you just watch what would happen. You'll be amazed.
Yeah.